What's up, ladies and gentlemen? It's your boy, the 11th Marquess of Leansbury, Jack Slack. And I, like many of you, am extremely glad to have mixed martial arts back in my life. Yes, there was a Bellator event on the Friday before Mayweather-McGregor, which I totally forgot about, and everyone else in the media totally forgot about. That's a real catch-22 for Coker and the boys. They announced that before the Mayweather-McGregor fight was announced, and then what do? Do you go ahead with it and get ignored? Or do you cancel it and refund all your tickets and move it to another date, which is going to cost you money? Wasn't a bad one, actually, Bellator at 182. Had Koreshkov on and Njoku. But we're not going to recap that here because I didn't watch the whole thing yet. I don't know if I ever will, to be honest. But we do have a UFC event from the Netherlands to cover, which actually wasn't terrible. I was one of those people going into this that was like, you shut down the UFC for 3 weeks before the McGregor fight. People are now talking about MMA in the wider world, and the first thing that you give them on TV or whatever we're actually watching this fight on is Stefan Struve versus Volkov. Just an awful, awful main event. And it was fairly awful watching it. But the card itself had a lot of good talent on, and some up-and-comers and some nice surprises. I think we're all thinking about the same one person when I say that, but there were plenty of guys on there who impressed me, and there were some fun moments to learn from and just enjoy. Made notes as I watched through this one, which is something I rarely bother doing, so I might go into too much detail on a couple of these, but I'll just get my thing out of the way. Thibault Gouti versus Andrew Holbrook. I thought that was an interesting one. Holbrook kept going for those snatch singles, you know, not dropping down for a knee, just reaching out to grab the single leg. And sometimes they work really well if you time the guy coming in, but Gouti got his timing very early. And Holbrook's... I'm noticing it more than ever now because of what I was talking about. You know, I was talking about this before the Mayweather-McGregor fight, which has come to overshadow everything, I'm afraid. But I kept saying in MMA, everyone just retreats from everything, you know, and that's how McGregor lines up that nice left hand. People run onto him. I said that top level boxers aren't going to do that. They double jab. They make sure they're in distance before they throw the punch. And that was the story with Mayweather-McGregor. Mayweather kept walking him down and only threw the right hand if he knew he could get it to the target before McGregor could react. You know, he was almost right on top of him before he threw the right hand and continued to step into him after he'd thrown it. Meanwhile, in MMA, you've got guys throwing their first punch and the other guy will immediately back up and they'll just run in after him swinging. There is no one thing that the MMA world could benefit from more than guys taking up the double jab or taking up the, raising your lead leg as if you're going to kick and just gliding in behind it. Ways that you make distance, feinting a strike without actually opening yourself up very much. Because Holbrook in this, he'd throw his first strike and Gouti would run a mile and then he wouldn't have anything to follow up, or he'd run through following it up and expose himself to easy counters. Holbrook also has a real bad habit of he'd land a punch and it'd look good and then he'd just stand there and get hit by 2 or 3 afterward. That was the old expression, admiring your work. But yeah, that was really noticeable with him. Really liked Gouti going to the hand trap right straight because he's against a southpaw. Hand trap, right straight, right elbow, that double up, really nice. Especially if the guy parries with his free hand. You can get him to bring it in and then go round it immediately afterwards. Nice way to cut people open. In fact, I can't even remember his name. The sort of unrated guy that Boakar lost to a while ago. He was a southpaw and he came out throwing the left straight and then he'd double it up with the left elbow around the side. And he didn't throw very much else at all. He just kept doing that. I believe he cut Boakar open, but he certainly landed a lot of damaging elbows and punches in that match. It also has that nice feel of just sort of like jamming it down the opponent's throat. It's not a very nuanced pairing, but it works very well from the open stance matchup. There was a nice right straight to the body from Gouti, and then he used that level change to set up the high kick almost immediately after in the next engagement. And the high kick landed, Holbrook went down. Holbrook grabbed a hold of the Kimura from the turtle, which you'll see a lot of guys doing. In fact, Keenan Cornelius was talking about this. There's great sparring footage between him and Marcelo, and he talks about how he loves going to that Kimura from the turtle. And Marcelo puts his knee on the tricep of the arm that's wrapping over, and just starts pulling his arm out. And Keenan Cornelius says, "No one does that when I do that." So it's a really neat little technique, and I've been doing it since I saw Marcelo do it in that role with Keenan. But it's just a really nice way to sort of free your arm and also take the power off that Kimura, which sort of sits there as potential, a potential disaster if you let up some pressure and let them stand up or build base Sakuraba style. And of course, if you got your elbow in deep, they can always roll over the shoulder in the style that Eduardo Tellez loved to do. But yeah, Gotti got his finish. It was nice. What else happened? Mihailovic versus Edilov. Edilov was a guy that had a lot of hype around him coming in, I believe, because he got signed and then he had an extended injury. But I was not impressed by Mihailovic at all. I thought he looked very... he didn't really ever get into this fight. He was stuck on the feet doing nothing against the awkward longer striker, whose striking wasn't... it didn't stand out to me as very impressive. He was, leading with these long telegraphed low kicks and things like that. They hit the mat in Mihailovic's guard, and Edilov just put the forearm across the throat and started throwing punches. And that's something that you really don't see working at the high levels in MMA, because guys realize you can't just sit there if things aren't going your way. You've got to open your guard, you've got to do something, you've got to try and stand up. Worst comes to worst, put in the knee shield and hope he tries to pass, and then you're working from half guard at least or something like that. But he just sort of sat there and got beaten up, and then the fight was over. Very underwhelming fight from both men. But then you had Zabit Magomed Shapirov versus Mike Santiago. Zabit will henceforth be referred to as Zabit. This is the guy that they were calling the featherweight John Jones. I think partly because he's 6'1", which is gigantic for a featherweight. Only one I can think of is was Roop. Was he? He might have been a bantamweight. I can't even remember. George Roop, but he was very tall for that weight class. Yeah, but Zabit, impressive stuff. There was a lot of stuff in there that in the same way that it was with John Jones, garnered a lot of attention, but was making mistakes, essentially giving the guy chances that he shouldn't have had. If you look at the old John Jones footage when he was like beating up Stephan Bonner and things like that, and then you compare it to when he really started becoming the best in the world, we're talking Shogun Fight and beyond, he stops giving the other guy so many opportunities. It's like, if you're good enough to fight out of the disadvantageous positions, that's great, but when you're getting in with the really, really good guys, it's better to just ruthlessly not offer them anything. Just keep jamming them from range, denying them the grips that they want, and denying them the opportunities. Whereas when you watched Zabit the other night, he's throwing wheel kicks from right on top of his man, turning his back from way too close. There was a lot of failed wheel kick attempts and things like that. John Jones would have loved that stuff when he was younger, but now you see him go to it more carefully. He'll set it up with other stuff. But I thought Magomed looked really good. Magomed Shapirov. I said Zabit. We'll call him Zabit. Thought he looked really good, even when he got to disadvantaged positions. Backed up to the fence a little bit too easily for my liking. He got caught on it very early by Santiago. But again, that's because his answer to almost everything was to back straight up, which is seen as great defense in mixed martial arts. But when he did hit the fence, he gave up double underhooks and then used the whizzer to ragdoll his man down to his knees and turned him around. Pretty cool, I thought. Landed a nice counter lead uppercut along the fence, and then that Showtime kick attempt off the fence over the back of the head. That could have been very nasty, but didn't turn out that way. And then immediately after that, he did another Pettis thing, a Sergio Pettis thing this time. The guy tries to grab a hold of him. He goes to the quarter Nelson, which is overhook and overhooking hand on your own wrist and the other hand on the face or neck. But he goes to the quarter Nelson and throws a high kick off it, which is something that Sergio Pettis does, which you don't see that often. But I really like it. If a guy gets caught in that, it's the standard way to fight off a single leg attempt on your feet. But if you keep a hold of the arm and the head as they release the leg, you're not going to be able to keep a hold, as in like keep control of them. But if you've just got that for a little while, you can throw the kick up as they back out, which again Pettis does, and Zabit did here, and I really like that. Just one of those things that hasn't made a huge difference in fights yet, but I'm always like, oh, I like that look. So very impressive fight, finished in the second round by Zabit. Really like the look of him. I hope he keeps improving, and can't wait to see what he's got in future. Other stuff that stood out at me. I mean, Rustam Kabalov beat Desmond Green. Kabalov, interesting guy to watch because he is, big throws, big punches, but he really needs to work on some striking. He can throw up a wheel kick out of nowhere and slap Masvidal across the face with it and things like that, but it's not so much the ability to throw fancy strikes as the ability to regularly use his normal strikes in a way that isn't just like one in every 8 connecting. He doesn't really set his stuff up well. Actually, we're going to have an interesting comparison between him and Nurmagomedov and Ben Askren when we talk about that later. But yeah, not a tremendously interesting fight. Kabalov picks up another decision. Standard Kabalov procedure. Prazeres versus Burnell, I thought was a really interesting fight. Prazeres, I believe, missed weight because he definitely looked much, much bigger than Burnell. It was like a man and a boy. It was really weird. I thought, Burnell would probably be able to step it up in the later rounds because his striking was much slicker. He had that sort of pity-patter striking, but then when one left hook sort of caught his man off guard, you saw it had a real effect. And that's the sort of striking that you see from guys who are more comfortable with their hands. They're happy to throw them out at like 50%, 60, 70% power. They're not tensing up, and then if one does snap the guy's head round when he's not expecting it, it'll have exactly the same effect. But Prazeres is... Well, firstly, the way he got him to the ground in the first round was a snap down. I don't believe he had any, useful grips for a snap down. He just grabbed the guy's head and threw him face down onto the mat. The strength differential in this was ridiculous. But the guard passing in this was really good fun, I thought. He was doing things like passing one side, switching to the other side. And I know that this guy, Prazeres, I've got to go watch all his fights now because he's got some interesting finishes on his record. But I know that he likes the Japanese necktie. He's got 2 finishes with that, I believe, which of course pairs in with the Das. If you don't know the Japanese necktie is effectively when you've got the leg trapped and you're going for the Das grip, but they're keeping their head straight. You put your belly over the back of their head and keep their leg trapped, and then you sort of crank their neck / choke them on your belly, like an otter with a clam. But that was the worst description of a Japanese necktie ever. But Shinya Aoki likes them. There's been a couple in the UFC now, but they're not very popular yet. If you like EBI and your grappling stuff, Richie Martinez is a guy who does a lot of work off the Peruvian necktie and the Japanese necktie. Peruvian necktie is stepping over the back of the head. Japanese necktie is taking the leg. But yeah, I knew that Prazeres had a couple of these on his record, so it was interesting watching him because he'd flop into half guard, and he's this, wider than he is tall. He's got that Palhares build and the classic Brazilian capped delts. But he sort of lays there in that please underhook me way. He's not even really looking for the underhook, and then as soon as they underhook, he starts trying to get their head or knee slide pass or put the knees straight to the other side and move to mount and get the guy to react so that he can do stuff. There are a couple of instances where he passed and he went to the sort of Billy Robinson style side control. If you know side control, crossface is normally the hand near the head is what that's normally doing, and then the near hand will either be searching for the underhook on the far side or underhooking the hip on the near side so that the opponent can't recover guard. That Billy Robinson style of side control is crossface again, but the hand near the legs is between the legs. You're underhooking the far leg, almost like the professional wrestling he's hooked the leg for the pin style. The danger of it is of course if you're doing it against someone who likes to throw their legs up and try and catch random stuff. Whenever you give them an opportunity, they can stuff your head in and start looking for reverse triangles, which aren't really effective, but they will allow the guys to scramble out to a better position as you start to try and take this, his vice grip of your head. But no, Prazeres did a really good job. He wasn't ever threatened by that. If you don't let the guy move your head down towards his legs, you're normally fine. But he was doing that so that the other guy would take the underhook, and then he was trying to free his arms and go for the Kimura, which I really enjoyed. Really interesting looks all around. And then he finished with a north-south choke, which is a good deal more subtle than a lot of people think it is, but again, it is also one of those ones where once they get it on, they'll be like, I don't mind if I squeeze your head off. It doesn't matter if it's not choking you, I'll just squeeze your head off. And it helps being gigantic for that. Obviously, Jeff Monson, very famous for it. But if you watch someone like Marcelo Garcia, it's quite hard to get the hands away from the neck cleanly enough to get the north-south choke. So guys like Marcelo Garcia have lots of clever little setups where they bump the hands with their chest. I think I've seen guys go to the knee on belly and then use the knee that's by the head to slide down the bicep and pin it to the floor. There's lots of cool setups for that, but basically he caught Burnell, pushing down with his near hand, which meant he could just go over the neck. There was nothing there stopping him. So an interesting fight nonetheless. A gigantic size difference there. Tazamov versus Silva was, 1 minute 24 knockout, and not a lot happened up to that. But again, this was that trying to cover distance. Guy steps in with the jab, the overhand, steps through on the overhand and runs onto the counter. Leaves his stance to try and swing at this guy and runs onto a right hand as a result. And then Darren Till versus Velikovic. Really enjoyed that. Darren Till, interesting character. Weird when he beats guys of very little importance on the world stage, and then he's like, "But I'm the best fighter in the world." And his shorts, he was wearing the white shorts, and they were basically the color of his skin. He is a pasty dude. I've heard he's been living out in Brazil for years, so that's got to be hard with that complexion. But I thought he was really interesting to watch. Obviously a fan of Saenchai and a lot of those other great Muay Thai legends who enjoy mugging. That retracting of the lead leg as soon as they throw the low kick and sticking your head out and mugging. That is just vintage Saenchai. You don't see that a lot in the UFC, but he was doing it a lot. The step-in elbow was gorgeous. Got his man to the fence, put pressure on him, feinted, the guy lifted his hands up and put him down again, so then he just stepped in with the elbow while the guy's hands were down by his waist from far too close in. Barberena versus Edwards, I can't remember much of. Wasn't a very interesting fight for me. Renault versus Bernardo, again, yeah, but CR the Great is back. That guy has had the worst luck in recent years. He stormed into the UFC with a one-punch knockout of Paulo Thiago. He was like, I'm the future, and then just disappeared for however many years. Had a couple of rough losses. Believe he arm triangled Brandon Thatch, but Brandon Thatch on the ground is, not a huge feather in your cap. But this knockout was nice. Very late stoppage, I thought, by the referee. I really liked the step-up body kick, and then as soon as his man shot in on him, in the aftermath of it, he tried to dive sideways onto that Das. The one that Edwin Namji, he hit a couple of those at, what was the major competition? I can't even remember what major competition it was, but it was a gi competition. He hit a couple of those, which were really nice. That fight wasn't of much note. And then Volkov versus Struve was just jank. Maybe the worst heavyweight kickboxing match to ever headline a main event headline a big event in the Netherlands. Actually, having said that, Anderson Braddock Silva has headlined events in the Netherlands. So, still pretty awful, though. Stefan Struve, constant flying knees, and you're like, why, Stefan? Why are you doing this? Constant long right uppercuts with his guard nowhere in sight. So he steps in close enough to throw it and then exposes his entire right side of his head to counter blows. A nice left hook would really give him some trouble. And then every time he kicks, and this has been the way forever, he steps in far too close. The Travis Brown knockout came as he stepped in to throw a stepping knee. But every time he steps up to kick with his left leg, Volkov shoots a jab down the centre and knocks him off balance. And then after the fight, Volkov, apparently he had Schilt in his corner, but he'd been working with Schilt for this fight. And he said, yeah, sparring Semi-Schilt is way harder than sparring Stefan Struve. I was like, well, no shit. Yeah, of course it is. Imagine working against Semi-Schilt, who does that step-up lead leg front kick, which kept guys like Badr Hari out on the end of his reach. And if you got caught on the end of it, that was you had a long night in store. He finished guys in the first round with that kick just by tapping him in the solar plexus a couple of times, winding them, coming down on the jab afterwards, setting up the left high kick off it. Guys would be crunching down with their elbows towards their body, and he'd just fling the left leg up around the side and kick him in the head. Imagine working against that, and then you're in with Stefan Struve, and every time he steps up to throw the left leg, he's wide open to be punched. Not a great fight. So much fucking finger poking in the eye. Sort the gloves out. They were talking about sorting the gloves out in like 2009. Just nightmarish. Both guys in there with splayed fingers going towards the other's face. I enjoyed Volkov quite a lot against Roy Nelson, but then, watching a guy strike against Roy Nelson in the second and third round is really just watching a guy work on a very tired heavy bag. Good on Volkov for pulling through in this one. It was an ugly, ugly fight. I don't know why Struve doesn't just work on his takedowns and try and get guys to the ground. His ground game is so good, and his striking is so poor. So the idea of this fight was that they would have like a backup challenger for Stipe Miocic now that they're running out, if Struve won. But, I wouldn't mind seeing Volkov versus Miocic. Not really invested in that division very much, but Miocic needs challengers. So not a bad night of fights overall. Not an awful lot to learn, but some cool moments. And then you would have been forgiven for missing Ben Askren's most recent title defense against Sebastian Kadestam, someone you've never heard of. Askren's third fight in a row against someone with no Wikipedia page. Back in April of 2015, he fought Luis Santos, or Sapo, in a fight where he couldn't get Sapo down in the first few minute and a bit, just kept failing on shots, and was already looking to be puffing when suddenly an eye poke stopped it as a no contest. So everyone was excited that ONE FC had actually found someone who could give Ben Askren a test. Problem was that Santos missed weight badly when they booked the rematch, and then just didn't get another shot. Sebastian Kadestam did beat Sapo in a very unusual fashion. He took a bit of a pasting for 3 rounds, and then landed a wicked flying knee while flying past the guard to knock him out with knees on the ground. So, he'd accomplished something big within one, but he only had one fight there, and he was 2-2 in his last 4. So really shouldn't have been challenging their world champion, but, you need bodies for Askren. The fight was standard Askren, just knocking the guy down onto his hands and knees again, taking the grip on the wrist, pounded him. Everything from BJJ Scout's most recent studies was on show. One-size-fits-all Askren game plan. Kept looking for arm triangles, kept getting mount, kept flattening the guy out on his front and hitting him in the back of the head. Referee was asked to stop the fight by Askren and then did. Askren wasn't really throwing heavy leather. Every time Askren fights, it's impressive in its own way, but equally, he's been fighting nobodies for years. And there's talk of his next fight with ONE being his last fight before he retires. And that would be a terrible shame because we wouldn't really get to see what he can do. Back in the day he was running through Bellator, but he left a little while ago, and now Bellator's division has come up loads. And it would be so much more interesting to see him back in that mix. But as Bellator is open to cross-promotion, and has a good relationship with most of the other companies, there's something they could always pursue, trying to get Askren in for a fight, which would be huge. Of course, you can't begrudge Askren for this. The UFC didn't really like his style, wasn't offering him as much money as ONE FC, and if you're going to get paid more money to beat up nobodies, who's going to turn that down, There's a lot of hate towards Askren online, but the funniest thing in the world is people being like, that one-dimensional style wouldn't cut it in the UFC. And you're like, have you seen Nurmagomedov fight? It's the same thing. Just keep a hold of the guy, keep knocking him back down. I mean, Nurmagomedov hits a bit harder and suplexes people a lot more, but Askren is just the same principle. Get a hold of them, keep tapping them down to their hands and knees again when they stand up. Stay on them for as long as possible, and you'll either catch the submission or win the decision. And perhaps the most frustrating thing about all of this is that he's a training partner of Tyron Woodley and of Anthony Pettis. So, even though he's quite small for a welterweight and people say that he should cut to lightweight, we have a good idea, or they have a good idea of how he stacks up in training with a world-class lightweight and the world champion welterweight. So, they all know how good or not Askren is, but none of us do. Very frustrating. Not much else of note on that one event, as far as I could see. Apparently the next match Askren's last match is going to be against Shinya Aoki, which could be amazing or could just be shit. Think Shinya Aoki versus Vitor Ribeiro. Striking between world-class grapplers. Right, quick plug and then we'll do some questions. If you haven't signed up to the Patreon, the new Patreon episode is on the way out now. We're doing the Pride Middleweight Grand Prix, the first one, which was 2 events in Pride FC with many of the best, well, they were technically light heavyweights by what we'd call them today, going at each other. And Zuffa had recently purchased the UFC and they took Chuck Liddell over to take part. And that, many great fights came out of that. You had guys like Vanderlei Silva, Quinton Jackson, Chuck Liddell, Marilla Bustamante, who got robbed in that tournament, Kazushi Sakuraba. You had everyone who was anyone in the world at that time was in that tournament. So that's what we're going to be doing in the new Patreon episode. If you want to join up and become a Patreon boy, much appreciated. Keeps the podcast going. If you haven't bookmarked thefightprimer.com, that is my new website. That's where I'm putting out just content when I feel like it. When I'm not selling anything to Vice or a magazine or something like that, I just like to pop my stuff up on there. For instance, the Miguel Cotto versus Yoshihiro Kamagai fight the other day. I didn't know what I was going to do with my thoughts on that, but people kept asking for it, so I just made a quick post-fight notes piece. Lots of GIFs, lots of information on the things I enjoyed and didn't enjoy in that fight. So that's just where I'm sort of putting up my own thoughts at the moment, and then there will be another big primer at some point. And then if you haven't bought Notorious, The Life and Fights of Conor McGregor, that is the best book out on Conor McGregor, one of the better books out on fighting, in my humble opinion, as someone who owns most of them. Someone sent me a picture of it in Dublin Airport on the stand for Irish Author of the Month the other day. I was like, keep that quiet. But then I suppose it goes both ways, because in the lead up to, I believe it was McGregor Aldo, people were saying that I was biased because I was a Brit and Conor was a Brit. I was like, what? I now have saved on my computer a picture of the map of England and Ireland with a big red line down the middle and shaded out Ireland saying, this is not Great Britain. Just for people who get confused. I understand, world geography is a hard thing to take interest in. Anyway, let's do some questions. Ahoy, Jack. What's your immediate impression of Zabit Magomedshapirov and his impressive UFC debut in Rotterdam? Cheers from Christopher. Really enjoyed it. I mean, guy's got all the potential in the world. It's one of those ones where you're watching it and going, this guy's making a lot of mistakes, but he seems like the kind of guy who, well, against this level of competition, the mistakes aren't mattering, and if he puts his mind to it and is made to realise the importance of not bothering with those mistakes, which he's choosing to make, the weird wheel kicks right on top of his guy and stuff like that, then he can definitely be a world beater. Tons of potential. Very interested to see where it goes. Oh, interesting one here. Hi, Jack. A point you make very often in your writing and on your podcast is that while the good/weak chin is a very real phenomenon, good defensive movement/technique is much more important for success in combat sports. On the other hand, you also decry headhunting and extol the attritive effects of body shots and also leg kicks. So that led me to wonder if there are any fighters who are especially good at taking body shots. After all, Donald Cerrone, Matt Brown and Daniel Cormier are well known for not taking body shots well, especially kicks/knees. Does the anti-Cerrone/Brown/Cormier also exist? And that's from Andrew. Cheers, Andrew. Cormier is always an interesting one, actually, because he carries a bit of a belly, which is normally seen as something that is helpful in taking body shots. The thought process has always been that guys who dehydrate themselves a lot, so this would be Donald Cerrone, someone who dehydrates himself a lot to get down to weight, has less fat protecting his organs and less to absorb that shock. Of course, Donald Cerrone went up to welterweight and didn't cut as much weight and still has trouble with body shots. I mean, I've heard all sorts of other things, like some guys believe that a narrow waist, that Bruce Lee tapering waistline, is indicative of inability to take a body shot and look for like a blockier, more square physique. It's one of those things where there's an awful lot of pseudoscience and old wives' tale because it largely comes from boxing. I think a lot of it also is knowing how to take a shot on the body. If you take it on the oblique, which is a nice big muscle that you work daily with your core work, if you turn and take a shot on the oblique, you're normally okay. I mean, that was Houdini's whole act. The taking the punch from the strongest man in the room obviously got him killed in the end. But be careful with that. If you take something on the oblique, or even in the center of the abdomen as you're crunching over, you're normally a lot better off than if you're extended, or if you take it straight in the solar plexus or around the side on the floating rib. Those are bits that really can, we don't talk about vital points much, but those are like the ones you aim for. There's a reason they called the solar plexus the mark back in the day. It was like the best target. But if you watch... I'm sorry, I keep using the Mayweather-McGregor fight as an example, but it's something that happened recently that almost everyone on the planet saw. So if you watch the Mayweather-McGregor fight, McGregor keeps shooting the left straight to the body as Mayweather walks forward, and Mayweather will, he's got his gloves up in front of his face, and he'll just crunch forward, and his body will go back and curl in, and it'll just be all his abs tightening up around that glove. Whereas if he stayed upright and kept walking forward, that left would probably hit him right in the solar plexus and ruin his day. And of course, you can't underestimate the experience of taking many, many body shots throughout your life. Mayweather's had people shooting at his body his whole life. Whereas if you're in MMA, not many people shooting it for the body. And in wrestling, you do tons of core work, but you're not getting hit there. The pseudoscience around body shots is remarkable anyway. There's all sorts of interesting ideas. It's the same with, it's got an overlap with breathing, which if you're even marginally involved with like the physical culture or weightlifting world or anything like that, breathing is always a contentious topic. There are guys who say you should exhale on the, on the extending part of the motion, whereas others believe that you should hold your breath. Haven't heard too many people talking about breathing in during the explosive part of a motion, but it's just interesting. Guys look at body shots as much about breathing as they do about conditioning. If you catch someone breathing in with a body shot, that's when you're most likely to hurt them. And this is where we get into the really nitty gritty stuff. I think it was Gogen Yamaguchi wrote like the 8 kyos or moments of weakness to look for, and some of them are things like that are fairly obvious, like as soon as an opponent completes a technique and is recovering, or during the extending part of the opponent's technique. And then some of them are like when he's breathing in, and you're like, well, how the fuck do you know when he's breathing in? But if you spar with someone who's really, really experienced, or someone who's a lot better than you maybe, if they start noticing you getting tired, they'll start feinting you. Especially if you're breathing obviously through your mouth, they'll start feinting just as you're about to breathe in and making you tense up. And that's something that like really savvy vets are good at, and Floyd's a good example of that. Someone who doesn't throw a whole heap of punches, but certainly makes you think he's going to at every point in the fight, It's constant feints and stuff. But we're getting off the topic of body shots now. Guys who are especially good at taking body shots in MMA, no one's really springing to mind. I think it's more like when we see someone take a single body shot and obviously get hurt off it, that's when we notice it. Body shots generally, unless the guy's really digging in deep and making an obvious thing of it, you can very easily miss how many strikes go into the body during a fight, just attempted, like kicks and things. The other interesting thing about body shots is that the effect is rarely like the doubling over in agony. That's the sort of thing we look for when someone's weak against body shots. One body shot will do the job. You're looking for a knockout. Generally, you're looking for that attritive, a word I just stole from your email, that effect of attrition where you you tire the guy with body shots. Which makes it tricky when you see someone like Roy Nelson, who, when he gets hit in the body, it doesn't look like it should do anything, but gasses almost immediately anyway. So you're like, what? Does he take a body shot well? Does he take a body shot badly? Is he just in terrible condition? It's a real head scratcher. Because obviously, the more fat you've got around your midsection, the less likely you are to be in fighting shape. You'll be soft. But if you have no fat around your midsection, then you don't have that absorptive layer that everyone speculates about. A complicated topic, which if you can think of someone who's really notable for their ability to take a body shot and not be bothered by it at all, whack them in the comments, because I'm really interested to see who can. Hey, we've got a message from my boy the Dub. Hey Jack, you have written articles and talked about the impact that rule sets have on techniques and strategies in combat sports, and we saw a great example of that in Mayweather vs McGregor. BJJ seems to be the only combat sport which does not put any emphasis on ring craft. There is no penalty for leaving the mat or any scoring advantage for controlling the pace. This often leads to practitioners simply leaving the mat to gain a reset, rather than having to scramble in order to avoid conceding a sweep. Obviously, in striking arts, this is a huge element of winning a fight, and even other grappling rule sets penalise leaving the mat. I think adding some penalty would make BJJ players more tactical in regards to forcing attacks in specific directions, or creating dead zones where the defending player is not allowed to move. This would increase top and bottom positional shifts, and improve scrambling ability, all of which would transfer better to MMA in my opinion. Do you think that the lack of mat control hurts BJJ in the same context of modern MMA? Thanks, your boy, the Dane Cook of butterfly hooks, Gamble Dub. Cheers, Dub. I was thinking about this the other day because I recommended that Tonin versus Buchecha match, and Tonin comes up on a single leg, one of those ones from like the X-Guard, or the similar sort of thing where you put the knee in, you come up and their knees pointing down and their legs on your shoulder, and Buchecha just runs off the mat. And everything stops and they're like, reset. And it just really hacked me off because I was like, that guy's in a really good position. And I've seen Leandro Lo do it too, run off mats to avoid anything. I've seen guys get disqualified for stepping off the mats in a triangle. I'm not up on IBJJF rules. Bring back knee reaps, goddammit. But I believe you can get disqualified in some competitions for stepping off the mats while the guy's attempting a submission. However, the fact that you can step off the mats while being taken down, or the guy's coming up on a single leg or something like that, and not be penalised at all, is remarkable. But then I was watching the judo, I think it was 2 Olympics ago, and there was a lass basically hanging out on the edge of the mat, looking for her grip, the first grip. And if her opponent got it first, she'd just step her foot out of the mat. And that really hacked me off. So, there's 2 sort of ways the ring craft can go. Obviously, BJJ competitions are held in just gym halls and places like that, so you are just dealing with mat space. We can't just add in boundaries and things like that. But I do like Chris Houter's approach, where he says, if you come and train at my gym, which is legendarily a garage, if you go and train at his garage, he says, like, anything that you can push off, you do. Even other people, if they're on the mats, you can push off the walls, you can push off the other people, because that's more like... I don't like the whole jiu-jitsu for self-defense thing, but if you take jiu-jitsu into the street or you take jiu-jitsu into the cage, then you're dealing with, there's going to be stuff in the way. And of course, if you've rolled, everyone's rolled at the academy where you bump against the wall and you're like, okay, well, that's where I was going to move to in almost all of my escapes. Can we please move back towards the center of the room? The addition of boundaries really changes jiu-jitsu just generally. And while, ringcraft, and I'm sure Dub knows this, but for everyone else listening, there is still a good degree of what we might call ringcraft. I use ringcraft as a fairly extensive term for all sorts of ring strategy, but it doesn't just, I'm not just talking about a lot of the time we are just talking about place in the ring, but there are a lot of things under there that I would include probably in ringcraft that maybe don't involve the ring as much. But you do see guys in BJJ, particularly in the new no sub competitions, sub only competitions, playing very, very different strategies. I was watching Tanquinho versus Eddie Cummings the other day, and that was Polaris, not their ADCC match. And Tankino starts on his knees and invites he's fighting off the leg lock attempt, and then I think they're a 15-20 minute match. About 10 minutes in, he just stands up and starts presenting the leg. He realizes that the guy's going to tire from attempting a few heel hooks, and then he starts getting more aggressive in the later rounds. And that's something that the EBI rules and things certainly make more interesting. If you just want to survive for the however long the time period is and then try and submit them in the overtime round, you can do that. But sorry, we're getting off topic there. We're talking about time limits and strategy, and what we really should be talking about is placement on the mat. There was a really interesting segment on YouTube I saw a long time ago with the great Wade Scholes, or Chalez maybe, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he's great. He's got like the most pins in collegiate history or something like that. But he was talking about coaching, and if one of his lads was going to concede a pin very soon, he said that you're not allowed to advise them to scramble off the mat, but he'd just shout location, and they knew that location meant run off the mat as fast as possible. I don't know how the rules have changed since he was doing that, but it just made me laugh a lot. If you agree beforehand on something being a foul and you have a code word for it, which really you should see more coaches doing if they were going to encourage fouling, because guys get fined or suspended from cornering in boxing for being like, use your head on the microphones, which is just the dumbest thing in the world. Yeah, I mean, the solution to this is pretty simple. Just penalise if you feel like a guy is going off the mat to avoid a disadvantage. What do they have in karate competition? Like a Jogai, you get 2 and then you get point deducted or something like that. Just like warn the guy the first time and then give an advantage to the other guy, or a point to the other guy, or something like that, depending on what rules you're fighting under. But I think definitely you need to do something about it. Otherwise, that is the standard get out of jail for everything. Again, could be wrong because I don't follow the IBJJF rules. I said that in a badass way. I mean, I don't know them very well. Hi Jack, great job on Notorious, and thanks for the Jaffa Cakes recommendation. Oh god, if you've never had a Jaffa Cake before, you've not lived, my friend. Champ Thomas mentions in How to Be an Ass-Whipping Boxer that orthodox fighters should always move laterally with the right foot in either direction. What are your thoughts on this? What do you think are the main differences in lateral movement and footwork in boxing versus MMA? Please let me know what you think on the next podcast. And that's from Ben. I cannot remember him saying this in How to Be an Ass-Whipping Boxer, but I've not read it through properly in a good while. But I do remember that Thomas obviously loves the side-on stance and loves pivoting around the lead foot. The pivoting around the lead foot as in, if you consider, like, okay, imagine yourself in a left foot forward stance, side-on, Stonewall / Philly shell style. If you're going to move to your left and you move your right foot first, you are basically performing a pivot. You can step the left foot out again afterwards and you've taken a side step, but in effect you're pivoting behind that lead foot first. That is a really nice defensive bait, offensive bait. It's a nice bait for a counterpunch. If you watch Roberto Duran's obviously my go-to example for this, but there's a few guys who've done it. If you're looking for reactions off that jab, some guys will throw the jab and duck in, throw the jab and pull back, and then they'll throw the jab and step their right foot behind their left, pivoting off, and that'll put them behind that left shoulder. And if the opponent's jab comes, it'll miss. If the opponent's right hand comes, it'll roll off the shoulder. You're putting everything behind that one shoulder, and then you step the left foot out again and come in with the right straight. Really subtle little setup. I think Don Fowlton covered it in his boxing series, which is really good. If you've not seen that, he didn't ever train anyone special. He trained with some guys like George Foreman and stuff like that, but he was just this old guy who gave some really neat tricks and advice. Now, the reason that that's not so useful in mixed martial arts is because if you start stepping with your right foot first when you're moving left, you're still, that lead foot is out there to be punted. And because you're performing like a pivoting style move, it'll be the back of your leg. So it won't be very enjoyable at all. The nice thing about sidestepping in the more orthodox footwork, if you're stepping your left foot out first as you step to the left, is that you can step into it, and then if the opponent does kick, he'll be kicking into your leg. You'll see guys like Frankie Edgar, when they step to the left and they point their knee 45 degrees out that way, and then they pivot in behind it. Almost like if you were passing if you're stepping into someone's guard, you keep that lead foot pointed out at 45 so they can't bend it in when they're looking for their De La Riva. You overcommit on stepping outwards. And that's a nice way to take kicks too. If you see a guy kicking, step forward on the 45, point that knee out towards the kick, and let the kick ride up your quad, as opposed to taking it into the side of the leg, which is where you're going to buckle. So there are obvious disadvantages to stepping with the right foot first when moving left in MMA. But I think if you use it within that one context where you jab and then you immediately pivot off behind your lead shoulder, that could still work very nicely in MMA, because you're jabbing into boxing range and inviting a counter. You're not really in kicking range anymore. Cheers, Ben. Hi, Jack. What are some ways to deal with strikers who immediately give ground when being pressured? I have tried adding feints as well as leg kicks as they circle or back up, but it's still tough, especially when at the first sign of an attack they are circling away. I have also tried to fight on the counter, however with an opponent who rarely engages it is still difficult for me to land cleanly. Also, ring cutting isn't possible because we spar on a wide open mat space. Thanks for any advice, from Brandon. Shit, as I was reading that, that was literally all the recommendations I was going to make. To be honest, part of it is anytime you're talking about doing something, it's practice. Tiki Donovan used to say, if you can do something in 5 minutes, there's no point in doing it because everyone else can. Good skills or applying skills effectively takes a long time more than understanding them in principle. Feinting is always a good way of getting the guy to either step backwards without you opening up. I'm assuming that the problem is that after they step backwards, they're countering too. If they're just stepping backwards, then you're not really sparring. You're just chasing a guy. But not opening yourself up to counters is the most important thing there, because if you consider someone like Lyoto Machida or Anderson Silva, they could spend a whole round or two doing nothing but retreating, and then eventually the guys start opening up and swinging wild, and that's the one thing you want to steer well clear of when you're dealing with someone who's backing straight up. Obviously, if you don't have any sort of wall that you can cut the ring on them and put them against, that's another pain in the arse. The low kick thing is tricky against someone who's going to back up straight away. You have to find where their leg's going to be rather than kicking their leg and hoping it stays still. One that's really helped me personally, don't know if it'll help you, but I really like any technique where you lift the lead leg and glide in behind it. They used to call it tobikomi in karate. I don't know what it's called in Muay Thai, but loads of guys do it. Sanchai especially. But you pick the lead leg up and glide in behind it, and that's basically like a whole step's distance you've made there. But once I land, I like to immediately bring the back leg up and step in with the lead inside low kick. And that is a nice way of, if you've got a guy who's going to immediately leap backwards, you make him leap backwards on the feint, and then you've made all that distance, and then you make distance again with another big kick to the inside leg. And that's going to pick his lead leg up and hopefully keep it there while you come in behind it. If not, that's a lot of running he's got to do. That's a very big distance-making technique. But there's lots of things like that. Find a feint that's going to get you a bit closer, and then a nice long technique on the end of it. We think of like inside low kick as like, this guy's running, better get him on the end of my inside low kick. But if you do a big feint before you even attempt the inside low kick, you've got a really good chance of getting him if he's really skittish. And as that sounds like, obviously one size fits all answer isn't going to work. But if you've got something like that, where you've got just one thing where you can catch him right on the end of your reach, score a couple of points on him maybe, that's the sort of thing where you can then say, or at least psychologically, they will think, okay, better get some back now. And that's when you can start working on the counter instead. It's when you're going after the guy and not getting any success that they can just get into that habit of running forever, especially if you're on a wide open mat. But yeah, little ideas like that are always worth looking into. But as Gamble Dub just said, like if you fight on a wide open plane with nothing stopping you, the guy who engages first or leads is always at a disadvantage. If the other guy's movement is completely free, he's going to really struggle. I hope that helps a little bit, but things to look for. Well, things to look for are people who gave guys like Anderson Silva, Lyoto Machida trouble. Dominic Cruz, obviously. Demetrius Johnson obviously hasn't lost any fights in the UFC yet. When was the Pickett one? Oh, and he lost to Dominic Cruz, but he hasn't really lost too many fights out of distance. But if you look at some of the guys who've had success low kicking him, that's another good one. And of course, it's annoying when you turn up to train, or especially if this is your hobby and you turn up to train and someone doesn't really want to engage. You're just like, why am I here? I'm wasting a round of my time. So just don't get frustrated by it, and treat it as a chance to work against something very specific, and then enjoy your sparring with everyone else. Cheers, Brandon. Right, on the subject of Demetrius Johnson, we've got the big event this weekend with the UFC's two least liked champions, certainly by the company, at least. You've got Demetrius Johnson versus Ray Borg, and you've got Amanda Nunes in the rematch with Valentina Shevchenko. Once again, I advise you, if you don't like the way the UFC are booking these people, don't buy this out of spite. Just don't buy it. That's the solution there. Obviously, there's a lot of that. Oh, Demetrius Johnson's ducking TJ Dillashaw stuff going on. I doubt he's ducking him. He wants that record from Anderson Silva for title defenses. If you're a guy who isn't selling pay-per-views, the records are fairly important. It's like when people were touting the latest submission. The co-main event podcast were talking about this a while ago, but it's not really something you should tout as like an amazing statistic. It means that he didn't get the submission until the last possible second. Anyway, Ray Borg coming in 11-2, 1 knockout, 6 submissions. But anyway, Demetrius Johnson said that he wanted TJ Dillashaw to prove that he can make weight first, even though he's taking a fight against a guy who's already missed weight. Oh, God. Hate on that, haters. But, Ray Borg did beat Lewis Smolka by decision, and Jussier De Silva by decision. Decent guys. Lost a decision to Justin Scoggins, and a split decision to Dustin Ortiz. I'll be honest, I don't care. I really, really don't care about this fight. Amanda Nunes versus Valentina Shevchenko, a little bit more interesting because the first fight was one where Nunes came out, didn't get anything done with her hands very much. She won the early rounds with takedowns and ground and pound, where you would expect Shevchenko to have a disadvantage. And then as the fight progressed, Shevchenko got more into it because Amanda Nunes faded, as Amanda Nunes tends to do. So over 5 rounds, this will be really interesting. Valentina Shevchenko, interesting striker. Amanda Nunes, obviously a more powerful striker, but a very nuts and bolts striker. Doesn't really have a lot of looks. Shevchenko really relies on the counter lead hook, the lean back lead hook and things like that. She'll throw the odd spin kick every fight and miss almost every single one. But at her roots, she's mainly like a counter hooker with some neat body kicks in there. Not a tremendous amount to tell you about that fight, but maybe something interesting will happen in it. I'll be watching that one. Pretty embarrassing how the UFC has made a U-turn on Amanda Nunes and completely failed to promote her. While, anytime a highly touted fighter loses, people are going to be like, well, they were overrated to begin with, which is what happened with Ronda Rousey. But a good many people would still be impressed if you just ran with the Amanda Nunes, what a monster, stopped Ronda Rousey in X seconds or whatever it was. If you went with that, people would respect that, because that's what people who know Amanda Nunes are saying anyway. It's not like Ronda Rousey is easy to stop, or someone she ran through that division for the longest time, and then Holly Holm, consummately outthought her and outfought her. To be honest, I would say that in the same way that Max Holloway's performance against Jose Aldo was more of a complete taking apart of Aldo than Conor McGregor's 13-second knockout, I would say that Holly Holm really showed a mastery of Ronda Rousey. But Amanda Nunes just came in and blasted her, which is, impressive in its own right, in a different way. Especially in a division where so few knockouts happen. They should be selling the shit out of Amanda Nunes. They should have Joe Rogan being, in the darkened room going, Amanda Nunes is a monster! And we should all be talking about how she's pound for pound number 4 or whatever, which really just shits on the pound for pound list when you're including someone who really, skill-wise, there are like 4 or 5 guys in every division of the male game who show more rounded abilities than her anyway. But that's pound for pound. It's a silly, silly business. But expect lots of it to be brought up because Demetrius Johnson's fighting, and he is pound for pound number 1 until he loses, and then you're going to be like, if Ray Borg beats Demetrius Johnson, does he instantly become pound for pound number 1? Is it a title, or is it based on skill, or is it based on accomplishment? What the fuck is it? Nobody knows. On the plus side, Rafael dos Anjos versus Neil Magny is happening on this card. I like that fight a lot. Big fan of Neil Magny, cool guy. Big fan of Rafael dos Anjos because he has that wicked style. I really hope to see him back in his element. He lost a little bit of that confidence after the getting caught by Eddie Alvarez. I would still love to see him fight Conor McGregor. I mean, that forward-moving pressure, love it. Gilbert Melendez is back after the longest time against Jeremy Stephens. Jeremy Stephens, I like watching Jeremy Stephens fight, but someone pointed this out to me the other day. He is the most overrated knockout artist in perhaps the history of MMA. He has 6 knockouts in over 25 fights with the UFC. Like, that's stunning that they're still building up as this amazing knockout artist. What he really is a guy with huge power who can't land it that often. But Melendez is on that streak of 3 losses. The Pettis one, pretty rough. Eddie Alvarez was a close fight. I don't really feel like that was a loss for him. Edson Barboza, a lot more complete loss there. Barboza was looking sharp as hell in that fight. Really, every time Melendez fights, you're looking for the right hand. The guy throws his right hand every time he steps in to punch, and very rarely throws the left hook after it or the jab after it. Very rarely closes the door. So he could be a sucker for the counter right hook from Dos Anjos. But Dos Anjos, really more of a left-hand heavy puncher. Really likes his left leg too. But if he was working specifically on the counter right hook for this fight, I think that would be money for him. That's what I told Benson when Benson was asking about Melendez before their title fight. I said that this guy really lags his left hand. He throws that right hand and then he draws it back like those vacuum cleaner cords, where you press the button and it reels it in slowly. That's what he's like with his right hand. But I think that's a really good fight, Jeremy Stephens versus Gilbert Melendez. Would not be surprised if you saw some slick wrestling in that. Jeremy Stephens, very hard guy to hold down, and that's really one of the more entertaining parts of his game for me. What else is going on? Henry Cejudo versus Wilson Hayes. Oh, did they make it onto the main card, or is more of the moving and shaking at flyweight happening on the undercard? Well, decent fight nonetheless. What else is happening? Ilir Latifi, falling asleep just reading that. Ilir Latifi's fighting some guy who's 6-0. That's a bit of a weird one. And then Francis Ngannou is still slated to be performing here, but against unknown fighter. I suspect he will not be fighting on the card. I don't know. Obviously, they lost JDS due to drug use of some kind, or tainted supplements. Let's be fair on this man. But yeah, I mean, that's a decent enough event. Don't know if it's worth buying a pay-per-view for. And then next week we've got Rockhold versus Branch, which is a really interesting one actually, because Rockhold's a guy who still is very high in the rankings, and Dave Branch is a guy who's done very well outside the UFC, quietly made his way into the UFC. But if he beats Rockhold, that's a huge deal. But again, that's something we'll talk about next week. I'm your boy Jack Slack. It's good to be back in MMA. If you haven't joined the Patreon, get in on the Patreon. We're doing the Pride Middleweight Grand Prix. If you haven't bought the book, buy the book. And if you haven't bookmarked thefightprimer.com, get over there. I've got new videos coming at some point. Catch you later.